They told you that in the beginning there was only Yahweh. He stood alone, eternal, unmatched before time itself. That's the bedtime story polished into sermons, repeated in Sunday school, and packaged neatly into hymns. But like every bedtime story, it leaves out the monsters under the bed. The truth is messier, louder, and far more interesting. Yahweh did not begin as the solitary Lord of heaven and earth. Instead, he emerged from a noisy, overcrowded divine marketplace. In Canaan, long before Israel dreamed of kings or prophets, the world was ruled by a pantheon. At the top sat El, the father of gods. His wife, Asherah, was the great mother, the womb of creation. Their children were a rowdy bunch. Baal, the storm rider who cracked lightning across the skies. Anat, the bloodthirsty warrior goddess. Mot, the god of death. And many others who filled every niche of human fear and hope. This was the divine council, the original heaven, if you like. And Yahweh was nowhere near the throne. If he existed in memory at all, he was a fringe figure, a desert deity tied to nomadic tribes roaming the southern wastelands of Edom and Midian. Egyptian inscriptions as early as the 14th century BCE mention a god named YHW in the region. Not in Israel, not in Jerusalem. Out in the margins, in the wilderness. Yahweh at first was a god of outsiders. Yet if you ask your pastor, you'll never hear this. Instead, you'll hear the sterilized version where Yahweh spoke to Adam, strolled with Enoch, judged Noah's generation, and whispered promises to Abraham, all with his personal name intact. But here's the catch. The Bible itself admits this isn't true. In Exodus 6:3, God says to Moses, "I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I was not known to them." Did you catch that? The patriarchs didn't know the name Yahweh. They worshipped a god they called El. The very same El who sat on the throne of the Canaanite pantheon. So why does Genesis sprinkle Yahweh all over the creation story and the flood? Simple. Editors. Centuries later, scribes who had already elevated Yahweh as the supreme God went back and retroactively stamped his name into every story, as if to erase the messy evidence of his rise. Imagine rewriting history to make your candidate look like he was president since birth. That's what happened to Yahweh's biography. But traces slipped through. That's the beauty of ancient texts. They can be sanitized but never perfectly bleached. One of the most explosive forgotten verses comes from Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. In the Masoretic text, the version most Bibles use, it says God gave the nations their inheritance. But the older version found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is much sharper. When the Most High, Elion, divided up the nations, he fixed their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob. Read that again slowly. Elion, the high God, distributes nations among divine beings. Yahweh isn't Elion. Yahweh is just one among the sons of God, assigned a territory, Israel. Like Zeus dividing kingdoms among his children, El Elyon handed Jacob to Yahweh. That means Yahweh had siblings, other gods ruling Moab, Ammon, Sidon, Philistia. No wonder the Bible constantly warns Israel against worshiping other gods. Those gods weren't fake. They were rivals. Even the Psalms refuse to play nice with monotheism. Psalm 82 imagines God standing in the divine council, judging the other gods. Plural. A whole boardroom of divinities. Yahweh might be presiding now, but the scene reveals his past. He came from among equals. And then there's Psalm 29, which scholars recognize as a hymn originally sung to Baal. It praises the god of storms, who rides on the clouds, thunders over the waters, and breaks cedars with his voice. Sound familiar? Those very lines were lifted, edited, and given to Yahweh. He literally took Baal's script and performed it himself. That's not divine originality. That's plagiarism with holy branding. So Yahweh's climb to supremacy wasn't clean. He had to claw his way up, absorbing the traits of El the Creator, stealing thunder from Baal the storm god, and even being linked to Asherah as his consort. Archaeological finds from Kuntillet Ajrud in the Sinai Desert, dating to the 8th century BCE, bear inscriptions that read, "Blessed be you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." Not once, twice. Yahweh and Asherah, written side by side. The Bible tried to delete her, but pottery tells the truth. Yahweh had a wife. Now go ask your pastor why that never makes it into Sunday sermons. Watch them stutter. If Yahweh began in a pantheon, how did he become the only God? The answer is political reform, not divine decree. Enter King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. Faced with a fractured kingdom and looming empires, Josiah needed unity. His solution? Centralize worship in Jerusalem and eliminate rival cults. Out went the Baal altars, down came the Asherah poles, and priests were told Yahweh alone was king. This wasn't spiritual enlightenment, it was religious nationalism. A small tribal god was transformed into the exclusive deity of a people because one king wanted loyalty, and the prophets followed suit. Hosea called Baal worship adultery. Jeremiah mocked the Queen of Heaven. Ezekiel condemned women mourning Tammuz. Every rival god became an enemy of Yahweh's honor. But let's not pretend it worked overnight. For centuries, Israelites still lit incense to Asherah, sacrificed to Baal, and swore oaths by other names. Even Solomon, the great temple builder, erected altars for foreign gods. Israel was never purely monotheistic in its early days. Yahweh only became God alone after generations of purges, propaganda, and priestly editing. This explains why the Old Testament reads like a schizophrenic mix. One moment Yahweh thunders, "I am the Lord, there is no other." Isaiah 45:5. The next, he casually acknowledges other gods exist but demands Israel avoid them. Exodus 23. "You shall have no other gods before me." Monotheism was not the starting point. It was the finish line. So why does the church bury this? Why do pastors cling to the neat lie of eternal monotheism? Simple. Because truth is dangerous. If Yahweh began as one God among many, then faith is not a timeless revelation, but an evolving construction. If the Bible itself preserves traces of a divine counsel, then Scripture is not a flawless download from heaven, but a battleground of competing memories. Religion thrives on certainty. God has always been God alone is simple, clean, and easy to preach. God rose from the ashes of a pantheon is messy, unsettling, and terrifying for people who need black and white answers. Pastors aren't in the business of unsettling. They're in the business of comfort. So the forbidden verses are buried under sermons about eternal truths. But what's more powerful? A static God who never struggled, or a God who fought, rose, and transformed. A God who won supremacy not by default, but by conquest of history itself? That's the Yahweh archaeology reveals, not the sanitized deity of church bulletins. Here's the forbidden conclusion. Yahweh was not born almighty. He became almighty. He rose from the pantheon, absorbed El, silenced Baal, erased Asherah, and rewrote history. And in that rise lies the true story of faith, not as eternal perfection, but as survival and transformation. And here's the twist. Even though pastors hide it, the Bible itself bears witness to this journey. Exodus admits the patriarchs didn't know Yahweh's name. Deuteronomy shows him as a portioned deity. Psalms sing of the divine counsel. Archaeology uncovers his partnership with Asherah. The evidence isn't hidden. It's forbidden. That's why forbidden verses exist. To speak the verses pastors will never read, to tell the history they cannot preach, and to remind you that the truth of faith is always bigger, messier, and more human than the Sunday version. So next time you hear a preacher declare, Yahweh was always alone, remember Deuteronomy's divine counsel. Remember Kuntillet Ajrud's pottery. Remember Psalm 82's boardroom of gods. And smile, because you know what they don't. Welcome to Forbidden Verses. This was just Genesis.